The war is over, but their hearts remember every sound of it. In the quiet hills, Kevin and Dito try to build a life from the ashes, one breath, one sunrise at a time. But peace has a way of testing the ones who deserve it most, because even love must learn to survive what comes next. The footsteps on the road. Dawn rose shyly over the hills, a pale wash of light slipping between the mango leaves and pooling in the ruts of the path. The world smelled newly rinsed wet earth sap, the faint afterscent of last night's rain still darkening the stone steps up to the porch. Kevin stood at the threshold with his hand around a chipped mug that had long since cooled, listening to the small sounds of morning, a rooster clearing its throat, the low river humming to itself, a single drop falling from the eave and bursting on the step like a quiet thought. Then he heard it faint at first, so soft it could have been the memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. A heel catching on grit, the weary drag of a soul over damp soil, one step another, a rhythm he knew in his bones the way a body knows its own pulse. He straightened without meaning to, mug suspended in the air. The old ache moved in his chest, that familiar, terrified hope rising too fast for breath to catch it. Not again, he thought, not another shadow that becomes a stranger, not another trick of light on the path. The steps grew clearer. There was the soft clink of metal against metal dog tags, or a buckle followed by a quiet, controlled breath, the kind a man teaches himself when pain sits in his ribs. The fog held the figure at arm's length, smudging edges, letting the imagination draw its own lines. For a moment, Kevin felt the two versions of himself split, the man who stayed still to keep from shattering, and the boy who had once run until his lungs burned, convinced love could be reached if only he was fast enough. He set the mug down very carefully, the ceramic kissing the rail. His hand found the dog tag at his chest and pressed until the cool shape bit the skin. The path bent around the banana grove, and in that small curve the world seemed to stop, the way air stills before a storm or a prayer. A shoulder emerged first, then the set of a jaw, then eyes Kevin had memorized long ago. Mud streaked the cheekbones, a windblown lock of hair stuck to his temple. He was thinner, the lines at his mouth deeper, a faint scar tugging at the skin near his collarbone, where the shirt gaped. He limped, but it was the stubborn, measured limp of a man who refused to be carried. Across it all, like a line drawn through smoke, there it was, the tired, crooked smile Kevin had dreamed so many times he had begun to hate sleep for its cruelty. Kevin, Dito said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The name arrived like a hand on the back of the neck, like warmth regaining a limb that had gone numb. Kevin's first sound was not a word, but an exhale that broke on the porch rail. He stepped down onto the path and then stopped, as if any sudden motion might cause the morning to blink and take this back. Dito's gaze flicked over him in a quick, hungry, sweep-cheek mouth. The tremor in his fingers softened into something that made Kevin's knees loosen. They closed the distance in small, unbelieving steps, like men crossing a river on stones, spaced just far enough that you must trust the next one exists. At arm's length, they paused. Kevin noticed the things one only notices this close, the stubble that shadowed Dito's jaw, the half-moon of dried mud under his sleeve seemed, the ridiculous way his left ear still bent at the top from an old break. Proofs, all of them, against the erasing power of months. Are you? Kevin began, and the question fractured. Are you hurt? Are you staying? Are you real? Dito's lips moved in the ghost of a laugh. Here, he said, as if it were a complete sentence. His voice was hoarse, the kind of hoarse that carries smoke and cold and too many nights without enough water. But there was no apology hidden in it, only a steady fact. Here. Kevin reached up, and the back of his knuckles brushed Dito's cheekbone, a tentative, reverent touch, the way one might test the surface of a lake to see if it's thawed. Heat met his skin, not memory, not dream. He cupped Dito's face fully then, fingers trembling, and felt the answering press of Dito's hand come up to cover his own, palm to knuckles. The way you close your grip around a rope. Let me look at you, Kevin said, and in the smallness of his voice was everything. Months of letters that went nowhere, the weight of a dog tag in the dark, bread burned because grief has poor timing. He traced the edge of Dito's brow, the familiar slope of nose to mouth, ended at the small notch of scar just beneath the collarbone, and rested there, as if placing a seal on a document that had taken too long to arrive. Dito swayed forward. The embrace found them as if it had been waiting at that exact spot on the path, folded and stored since the day they parted. It was not tidy. Kevin's breath hitched in a half-sob. Dito's pack thumped against Kevin's hip. The strap scraped Kevin's forearm, and he clutched harder, uncaring. Dito's chin landed on Kevin's shoulder and stayed there, the weight not crushing but anchoring, as if he had finally allowed gravity to do its work. I thought Kevin started into the cloth of Dito's shirt, and then the word jammed against his teeth. He shook his head hard, a small, violent refusal. "No, you're here." "I am," Dito said. He did not say "I'm sorry" or "I couldn't write" or "it was worse than we expected." Those could come later, or not at all. He said, softly but with the stubbornness Kevin knew too well, "I kept the road in my head. I kept you there. That's how I walked." They stood like that until the path itself seemed to exhale a morning breeze, slipping through the leaves, an insect stitching air between them with its thin whine, the far familiar clatter of an old cart beginning its day. Kevin's hands learned Dito again in small, necessary conformations, the breadth of shoulder under thin fabric, the line of spine beneath his palm, the way Dito's breath changed when Kevin's thumb slid unconsciously to the base of his neck and settled there. "Inside," Kevin whispered at last, and even that single word trembled, as though the house might refuse to recognize joy after so much quiet. He eased back only far enough to see Dito's face. Mud had dried into pale maps along his jaw. His mouth bore the stubborn set of a man who had argued with rain and kept walking. A purpled bruise shadowed the bone beneath his eye that made Kevin's stomach drop with a delayed, protective fear. He lifted a hand and hovered, as if asking permission to worry. Dito made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and tilted into the touch. They moved together toward the porch. Dito's limp made their cadence uneven. Kevin matched it without thinking, slowing where Dito slowed, pausing when the step asked more of him than it should. On the top stair, Dito faltered, the effort of arrival catching up at last, the little wince he tried to swallow, the breath he held for a count, and released. Kevin took the weight of the pack from his shoulder and set it down by the door with care. One usually reserves for heirlooms and sleeping birds. The door opened with its familiar wooden sigh. The little house inhaled them as if lungs had been holding air in its walls, waiting. Kevin felt suddenly foolish for every time he had wiped the table twice, for every time he had turned the cup so its chip faced away. He wanted the room to look like welcome, not waiting. He wanted it to show Dito that time had passed, but had not taken anything worth keeping. Dito stopped on the threshold and lifted his gaze around the room the way a man looks at a landscape. He has dreamed of too precisely checking his memory against fact. The kettle on the stove, the scarf folded on the bench, the cinnamon stick still on the shelf, paper browned with age. He closed his eyes briefly, the kind of brief that stores a picture. Kevin heard himself speaking before he chose the words. "Sit," he said. "Please hear." He pulled the chair closer to the hearth, the one he had slept in when silence and dread made the bed too wide. Dito lowered himself into it with the cautiousness of a body that knows what pain will ask if you are careless. Even the settling the sigh that slipped out, the palm pressed briefly to his side felt like proof. A living man's inconveniences, a living man's tiredness. Their eyes found each other again. And there it was, the unguarded flash of relief that made them both look away for a heartbeat, because of how naked it felt. Kevin knelt without meaning to, the way one kneels to tie a boot or pick a dropped coin, and his hands went to Dito's laces. Mud loosened in damp clumps. He slid the boot free and set it aside, then rested his palms lightly over Dito's ankles, feeling warmth thrum against his skin. Dito's fingers threaded into Kevin's hair at the crown. Not to guide or claim, but simply to feel. "Hey," he said, using the everyday word like a blessing. Kevin laughed, a short, astonished sound. It tasted like water after salt. He leaned up and pressed his forehead to Dito's, closing his eyes as their breaths mingled. In that small, still contact, the noise in his chest eased the river of worry dammed, the storm of rumor gone to distance. He became aware of small realities, the rasp of Dito's stubble against his skin, the candle's wick clicking softly as it consumed itself, the quick, answering flutter of Dito's pulse where their wrists touched. "Stay," Kevin said, and this time the word did not plead. It rang like a nail driven true. Dito's hand slid to Kevin's cheek and stayed there, thumb tracing a line he had traced 1,000 times in memory. "I'm home," he said. The room seemed to grow larger around the sentence, as if the walls had been braced against bad weather and could finally set their shoulders down. Outside, the village was waking the rattle of a distant gate, a snatch of song, a dog giving opinion to the morning. Inside, time curled itself at their feet, like a patient animal. They did not rush what came next. There would be stories to tell and to refuse, water to heat, clean cloth to trade for dirty, the slow work of handing a body back to ease. But for now they stood and sat and breathed and touched in quiet, necessary ways, palms confirming wrists, chests learning the other's rise and fall, again until the light through the shutters warmed from grey to gold, and the long, brutal road loosened its hold on Dito's shoulders. "Breakfast," Kevin said at last, voice steady, almost like any other morning. He smiled, astonished at the shape his mouth remembered. "And after everything," Dito nodded, eyes bright with a tired, grateful joy. "Everything," he echoed. And the day, which had begun as if afraid to show itself, finally opened. The door that finally opens. The old hinges protested with the same groan they'd made every morning Kevin had opened that door to emptiness. But this time, when he pushed it wider, the threshold did not echo. It caught a shadow, his shadow thick with road dust and disbelief. For a heartbeat they only stared. The soft spill of light from the window framed Dito in a haze of gold, turning the grime on his uniform into threads of bronze. The scent of rain and iron drifted in with him, unfamiliar yet achingly known. Kevin's fingers, still gripping the edge of the door, trembled so hard the latch rattled. Dito spoke first. "It still smells like you make tea every morning." The words broke something gentle and dangerous inside Kevin. He wanted to laugh, to fall apart, to collapse against that ruined chest and ask 1,000 questions, but his body refused to move. "Come in," he whispered instead, his throat tight. "Before I start thinking you're a dream." Dito's mouth tilted upward. "Then I guess you'll have to keep dreaming." He stepped across the threshold, boots leaving damp marks on the worn floorboards. Kevin closed the door behind him with care, as though afraid the act of shutting out the world might make Dito vanish again. The small house felt smaller. Suddenly, every memory pressed close around them. Listening, Dito set down his pack. The thud was final, like a story finished. When he straightened, their eyes met, and the air changed. The long months of silence collapsed into one impossible instant. Letters, unsent prayers whispered into pillows. The smell of smoke and sea salt on skin remembered too vividly. Kevin moved first this time. The step forward was hesitant. The second, certain. He reached out, his hand hovering near Dito's chest before settling over the heartbeat there. Warm, steady, real. His breath hitched, and he let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Dito's own hand rose, covering Kevin's. "Still beating," he murmured. "For you." Something inside Kevin broke open. He pushed forward, closing the last space between them. The impact was gentle but desperate, chest to chest. The soft thud of heart against heart, their breaths colliding in uneven rhythm. Dito smelled of smoke and rain, Kevin of soap and sleepless nights. They fit like a sentence finally finding its ending. "Say it again," Kevin whispered into the hollow of Dito's throat. "I'm here," Dito said, and tightened his hold. "I'm home." They stayed that way, motionless, the old floor creaking beneath their weight, until the quiet between them deepened into something neither dared disturb. Outside, the village stirred, roosters, cartwheels, the far murmur of the river, but inside the house, time folded. Kevin drew back just far enough to see Dito's face. The lines of exhaustion there only made him more beautiful proof of endurance, of promise kept. "You look older," Kevin said softly. "And you look exactly the same," Dito replied, his thumb brushing away a tear before it could fall. "Still the reason I made it back." A faint, unsteady laugh escaped Kevin. "I stopped believing in miracles." "Then let this one change your mind." Dito's hand slid from Kevin's cheek to the back of his neck, fingers threading into his hair. He leaned forward until their foreheads touched. The warmth of it undid them both to men who had spent too long speaking to ghosts, now relearning how to breathe the same air. Kevin's eyes closed. "If I wake up alone again, you won't." Dito's voice was low, firm. "Not tonight. Not ever, if I can help it." The promise hung between them, raw and sacred. When Dito's lips found Kevin's, a kiss was not the wild hunger of reunion, but the quiet claiming of what had always been theirs. Slow, shaking, full of awe. Kevin tasted rain, salt, and the faint metallic temps of blood where Dito's lip had split. It was imperfect and human and enough. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Kevin pressed his forehead to Dito's again. "You're staying." "I'm staying," Dito echoed. And then, softly, Now close the door, for real. Kevin did. The latch caught. The sound small but certain. The world outside went on turning, but in that small room, with Daito's hand still resting against his heart, the war, the fear, the long silent soul of it stopped. Touch, like first light. The morning arrived shyly, as if uncertain it had permission to intrude. Pale sunlight slipped between the shutters, scattering itself across the room in soft, golden fragments. The dust motes swirled lazily in the air, tiny witnesses to a peace that felt too fragile to name. Kevin stirred first. For a long moment he simply watched, hardly breathing, afraid even the smallest motion might wake him from this quiet miracle. Dito lay beside him, turned slightly on his side. One arm slung across Kevin's waist, the rhythm of his breathing deep and steady. The warmth of it sank into Kevin's skin, familiar and unbelievable all at once. He studied the details he had lost to memory, the faint scar at Dito's jawline, the curve of his lips softened by sleep, the way his lashes cast small shadows on his cheeks. His hair had grown longer, a little untidy, and a streak of silver near the temple caught the light. Kevin wanted to touch it, to prove it was real, but for a moment he just watched, chest tightening with the slow ache of joy. Outside, the morning birds had begun their patient chorus. A rooster crowed somewhere near the river. Someone's kettle whistled faintly down the hill. The house, quiet for so long, seemed to hum again, alive with small sounds that had forgotten how to exist when he was alone. When Dito finally stirred, his hand flexed where it rested against Kevin's waist, fingers tracing a half-conscious circle on his shirt. Then, without opening his eyes, he murmured, "You're real." Kevin smiled. "I should say the same." Dito's lips curved into a faint grin, and he blinked awake, the brown of his eyes deepened by sleep. "Morning," he said, voice low, rough with rest. Kevin reached up and brushed his knuckles lightly along Dito's jaw. "Morning," he whispered back. The word felt sacred. For a while, they didn't move. They only breathed together, the quiet between them stretching like warm sunlight. Kevin's fingers traced the edge of Dito's collarbone, down the curve of his shoulder, lingering where muscle met scar. Dito caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his palm before guiding it to rest over his heart. "I didn't think I'd ever hear morning again," Dito said. "Not like this." Clifton's breath trembled. "You kept your promise. So did you." He shifted closer, forehead resting against Kevin's. The touch was gentle, reverent. There was no urgency, only the slow relearning of a body once lost, the careful rediscovery of a heartbeat long prayed for. Dito's thumb brushed along Kevin's lower lip, a silent apology for all the letters never sent, all the nights that had gone unshared. Kevin caught the thumb between his fingers, holding it there. "You don't have to explain," he murmured. "You're here, that's enough." Dito smiled, small and sincere. "Still, I want to," he told him then in low fragments between touches about the nights of marching through rain, the men lost along the river, the weeks of silence when words felt heavier than bullets. Kevin listened, head resting on Dito's chest, the soldier's voice a steady drumbeat beneath his ear. When Dito's words faltered, Kevin reached up, silencing him with a kiss to the center of his throat. "You don't have to be brave here," he said softly. The soldier's breath hitched, and for the first time, he let it. His hand came up to cradle the back of Kevin's head, holding him close. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of everything they didn't need to say. Sunlight spilled across them, painting their skin in soft warmth. The rhythm of the world beyond their walls, the rustle of leaves, the far laughter of children, the clang of distant metal slid gently back into their awareness. Like a melody returning after a long pause, Kevin finally rose to make tea. Dito watched him from the bed, eyes following every movement, the way his hair caught the light, the quiet grace in his steps. When Kevin glanced back, Dito smiled faintly. Kevin asked, a blush rising despite himself. "Nothing," Dito said. "Just remembering what home looks like." Kevin's lips curved into a small, helpless smile. "Then you'd better get used to it again." Dito leaned back, hands behind his head, that rare, quiet joy settling on his features. "I plan to." As the kettle began to hum, Kevin poured 2 cups, the steam curling upward like a benediction. When he handed one to Dito, their fingers brushed. The warmth of that small touch spread faster than the tea itself. Neither of them spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. The air was full of the unspoken, the sound of reunion, of promises unbroken, of hearts relearning the rhythm of togetherness. And when Dito finally said, "It feels like the first morning of the world," Kevin nodded, eyes shining with quiet tears. "It is," he whispered. "For us, it is." The weight of the uniform. The morning deepened into warmth. Light moved slowly across the walls, gilding the rough wood, softening the corners of the room where dust and years had gathered. Outside, the sound of life returned, the creak of a cart, a dog barking somewhere near the fields, but inside the little house, time had slowed to a gentler rhythm. Dito sat at the edge of the bed, half in shadow, his hands resting on his knees. His uniform hung on him like an old promise, creased, heavy with dust, and darkened by stains that told stories he hadn't spoken yet. The jacket was buttoned unevenly. One cuff was torn, the fabric stiff with old mud. Kevin stood by the table, watching him in silence, the steam of their untouched tea curling between them. He crossed the room slowly. "You should take that off," Kevin said softly. Dito looked up, meeting his eyes with a tired half smile. "You never did like it, did you?" Kevin shook his head. "I didn't hate it," he said, kneeling before him. "I just hated what it meant." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, with quiet care, Kevin reached for the first button. His fingers brushed the coarse fabric, then the warm skin beneath as he worked his way down. Each undone button felt heavier than the last, as if every thread held back months of fear and waiting. When he reached the last one, he hesitated. Dito's breath caught, the faintest tremor passing through him. "Go on," he murmured. Kevin slid the jacket from his shoulders. The fabric fell away with a sigh, landing in a quiet heap on the floor. Beneath it, Dito's undershirt was damp at the collar, clinging to his chest. There were marks Kevin didn't recognize, faint bruises, scratches, a fresh scar just under his ribs. He lifted a hand and traced the edge of it with his fingertips, so light it barely counted as touch. Dito exhaled. "A gift from the road," he said quietly. Kevin didn't answer. He only leaned forward and pressed his lips to the scar, a kiss that was neither pity nor curiosity, only reverence. Dito's hand came up to rest on Kevin's hair, the motion trembling, uncertain whether to stop him or pull him closer. When Kevin looked up again, his voice was steady. "You don't have to carry it anymore." Dito gave a faint, disbelieving smile. "What if it's the only thing keeping me standing? Then let me share the weight." The words lingered, small but certain. Kevin slid his hands along Dito's arms, feeling the tension there, the sinew and strain of too many months in the field. He guided one sleeve down, then the other, until the uniform was gone, replaced by the quiet intimacy of skin and breath. The air between them shifted. It wasn't desire that filled it, not yet, but something deeper, the slow unraveling of armor. Dito's shoulders sagged, as if finally remembering what rest felt like. Kevin's palms found their way to his back, fingers tracing the curve of muscle, the rise and fall of his breath. For the first time since he had returned, Dito let out a sound half sigh, half shudder, and folded forward until his forehead rested on Kevin's shoulder. Kevin held him there, one hand splayed against the back of his neck, the other moving in slow, soothing circles across his spine. They stayed like that, for a long time, two men relearning the shape of each other's silence. When Dito finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I thought I'd forgotten how to be touched." Kevin smiled faintly against his hair. "Then let's remember together." He helped Dito lie back on the bed, easing him down with gentle insistence. The sheets were cool against his skin, the sunlight warm on his face. Kevin dampened a cloth and wiped away the dust along Dito's arms, his throat, his chest. It was not care born of duty, but of love, each pass deliberate, a ritual of return. As he worked, Dito's eyes drifted closed. "You're quiet," he murmured. Kevin paused, squeezing water from the cloth. "If I speak, I'll start crying," he admitted softly. Dito reached out blindly, fingers finding Kevin's wrist, then let it happen. Kevin leaned forward until their foreheads touched again, the way they always seemed to. "No," he whispered, "not yet. I want to see you first, all of you, alive." When Dito finally opened his eyes, what passed between them was not fire, it was warmth, deep and steady, like the glow after a long storm. The soldier and the healer, the man who left and the one who stayed. Kevin brushed one last streak of dirt from Dito's shoulder and sat beside him, their hands finding each other without effort. Dito turned his palm up, pressing Kevin's fingers to the center of it. "Feels lighter," he said quietly. Kevin smiled. "That's the point." And for the first time since returning home, Dito laughed, a low, disbelieving sound that broke something heavy in the air. Kevin leaned into it, resting his head on Dito's chest. Outside, the sun climbed higher, flooding the room with gold. The uniform lay forgotten on the floor, a crumpled memory. The weight had shifted, no longer something one man had to bear alone. The river's blessing. By late afternoon, the heat had settled low over the hills, soft and golden. The cicadas had begun their lazy song again, and the smell of rain-soaked earth lingered in the air. From the doorway, Kevin watched the sunlight filtering through the leaves, painting patterns on Dito's bare shoulders. It had been a long time since Dito had stepped outside without his armor of fabric and duty. Now, in nothing but loose trousers, he looked both vulnerable and renewed, like someone relearning what air felt like on skin. Kevin held out a hand. "Come with me." Dito glanced at him, half curious, half amused. "Where to?" "You'll see." They followed the narrow trail that wound through tall grass until the murmur of the river began to rise, a sound both familiar and forgiving. When they reached the bank, the water gleamed like glass, carrying flecks of gold where the sunlight touched it. For a moment, neither spoke. Dito crouched, dipping his fingers into the current. The coolness seemed to startle him. "It's colder than I remember." "That's because you've been gone too long," Kevin said softly. He knelt beside him and cupped water in his palms, letting it trickle over Dito's wrists. "The river doesn't forget, even when we do." Dito smiled faintly, then bent to splash water gently at Kevin's arm. "Then maybe it remembers us both." Kevin laughed, an unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both. It was the first time laughter had felt natural in this place again. Soon they were standing knee-deep in the shallows, trousers rolled, water swirling cool and clear around their legs. Kevin waded closer, his hand brushing Dito's. Dito turned, and their eyes met over the rippling water. Without a word, Kevin reached up and began washing the last traces of dust from Dito's skin, the curve of his neck, the line of his shoulder. It wasn't just cleansing, it was a quiet ceremony. Each motion said, "You're here, you survived, you can start again." Dito stood still under the touch, head bowed slightly, eyes closed. "Feels like I'm shedding a whole year," he murmured. Kevin's voice was barely above the whisper of the current. "Then let it all go." He poured water over Dito's back, watching the rivulets trace paths down the muscles, carrying dirt and memory away. Dito turned slowly, the light catching in his eyes. "Your turn," he said. Before Kevin could protest, Dito dipped his hands in the river and lifted them, letting the cool water spill gently over Kevin's shoulders. The shock of it drew a small gasp from him, but then Dito's hands followed, warm against the chill, smoothing the droplets away, tracing the outline of familiar bones and forgotten touch. They stood close now, the river tugging softly at their ankles, the air thick with warmth and quiet reverence. Kevin reached for Dito's wrist, holding it there against his chest. "You feel that?" Dito nodded, still beating. For both of us. Their foreheads met, skin damp and cool, the scent of river water mingling with the faint musk of sweat and sun. When they kissed, it was gentle at first, more a meeting of breath than lips, but then deepened, slow and certain, as if they were sealing something wordless and ancient. Around them, the world seemed to hush, the wind, the water, the hum of distant fields, all pausing to bear witness. When they finally broke apart, Dito traced a thumb over Kevin's cheek, brushing away a droplet that might have been water, or might have been a tear. "I never thought I'd find peace again," he said. Kevin smiled faintly. "You didn't find it, you came home to it." They lingered in the river until the sun began to lower, the light turning honey-colored against the surface. By the time they walked back toward the house, their clothes were damp and their hands were still intertwined. The river had taken something from them, the weight of absent sand left in its place, a quiet certainty. As they reached the porch, Dito looked back once, toward the glimmer of water in the distance. "It feels like it forgave me." Kevin stepped close, resting a hand on his arm. "Maybe it did, but you don't need forgiveness, Dito, just time." He leaned in and pressed a kiss to his shoulder, light, certain, full of promise. Behind them, the last light of day stretched long across the fields. Ahead, the small house waited, its door open, its walls warm with the scent of tea and home. For the first time in years, Kevin and Dito walked back inside together, not as the soldier and the one who waited, but as two souls finally returned to the same rhythm. A night remembered forever. The evening air was soft when they returned from the river, clothes still damp, laughter fading into something quieter. The small house welcomed them with its familiar scent: tea, wood, and the faint echo of the lives they had once shared within these walls. Kevin lit a single lantern. Its glow spilled across the room, golden and trembling, catching in Dato's hair and tracing the outline of his jaw. For a moment they simply stood there, the air between them warm, charged not with urgency, but with the gravity of reunion. Dato reached first, brushing his knuckles along Kevin's cheek. "You still keep the light the same way," he said softly. Kevin smiled faintly. "I left it burning every night, just in case." Dato's breath hitched. "Then I guess I finally made it home." They didn't need more words. The silence was full enough of years lost, letters unsent, nights spent imagining the other's warmth. Dato lifted a hand to Kevin's neck, his touch slow, reverent. Kevin leaned into it, eyes closing as though trying to memorize the shape of the moment. When Dato pulled him closer, it wasn't with hunger but with the kind that comes from too much missing. They stood like that, forehead to forehead, breaths mingling in the lantern glow. Kevin's voice was barely a whisper. "You're real." "I am," Dato murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of Kevin's jaw. "And I'm not leaving again." The words settled between them like a vow. They moved together slowly, learning each other again, not as they had been, but as they were now, changed, older, softer. Every touch spoke where words failed, the brush of fingers over skin, the quiet pull of a breath, the way Dato's hand lingered at Kevin's waist, as though anchoring him to this reality. The lantern flickered, casting light that swayed like memory. Shadows moved across their faces, tender and fleeting. When Kevin laughed softly, Dato caught it with a kiss, gentle, unhurried, tasting of river water and forgiveness. Time seemed to fold. The world outside fell away, the wind, the war, the ache of distance. All that remained was warmth, the steady rhythm of Dato's heartbeat beneath Kevin's palm, the sigh that escaped when their foreheads touched again, the way their hands found each other even when they moved apart. Later, when the lantern burned low and the room dimmed into the color of quiet dawn, they lay side by side. Dato's arm rested over Kevin's chest, his fingers drawing slow, absent circles on his skin. Kevin whispered into the silence, "I thought I'd forgotten how to breathe without waiting." Dato's reply was almost lost to sleep. "Then, breathe with me now." And Kevin did. In that stillness, every exhale felt like a promise renewed, every inhale a prayer answered. Outside, the night deepened, but inside, beneath the fading light, two lives once divided by war and waiting had found their rhythm again. A night not born of fire, but of return. A night that would live quietly in their bones forever. Morning without fear. Morning found them wrapped in quiet warmth. The first light of dawn seeped gently through the window, spilling across the bed in threads of pale gold. The air smelled faintly of rain, river water, and something new, something like peace. Kevin stirred first. His hand, resting over Dato's chest, rose and fell with each steady breath. He watched the rhythm for a moment, memorizing it, as though afraid it might vanish if he blinked too long. The soldier's face, softened by sleep, looked almost boyish again. The lines of exhaustion had eased, leaving only calm. Kevin smiled. He couldn't remember the last time he'd woken without dread pressing against his ribs. No dream of battle, no echo of absence, just breath, warmth, and the faint creak of the world coming alive outside. He brushed a thumb lightly across Dato's jaw, tracing the shadow of stubble there. Dato shifted, his lips curving into the smallest smile even before his eyes opened. "Watching me again," he murmured, voice still rough with sleep. Kevin chuckled softly, "Just making sure you're real." Dato's arm tightened around him. "You said that last night, and I'll keep saying it," Kevin whispered, "until it stops feeling like a miracle." They stayed that way for a long time, two men lying in the soft light, saying little, needing even less. When Dato finally opened his eyes fully, he found Kevin still looking at him with that quiet awe that made his chest ache. "I missed this," Dato said, "waking up to someone who isn't afraid of me." Kevin's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He leaned in and kissed the corner of Dato's mouth. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Every day you were gone, but never of you." Something in Dato's gaze softened even more. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving you were right." Kevin laughed quietly, pressing his forehead to Dato's. "You already have." They rose slowly, reluctant to let the moment end. The room was full of morning birds outside, the soft hum of a waking village, the distant splash of someone drawing water. Dato pulled on a clean shirt, one of Kevin's, the fabric too small across his shoulders. Kevin teased him for it. Dito grinned and said, "Then you'll just have to get used to me stealing more." Breakfast was simple steamed rice, sliced mango, and tea that had cooled by the time they remembered to drink it. Dito sat cross-legged at the table, and Kevin poured water into the basin beside him to wash the dishes. Every now and then, one would glance up, catch the other's eye, and smile like boys sharing a secret. When Kevin leaned over to dry a plate, Dito reached out and caught his wrist. "Kevin," he said, his tone soft but certain. Kevin turned, puzzled, and Dito pulled him close until their foreheads met again. "You can stop waiting now," he whispered. "I'm really home." Kevin's throat tightened. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to hear that." Dito smiled, brushing his thumb against Kevin's cheek. "Then let's start learning what it means." Outside, the world carried on, vendors setting up their stalls, children calling to one another, the morning swelling with noise and life. But in that small house on the hill, the sound that mattered most was laughter, quiet, steady, real. Kevin and Dito ate together in the sunlight, hands brushing now and then, unafraid of who might see through the open window. For the first time since the war began, morning felt simple, and for the first time in either of their lives, love didn't have to hide. The sun rose higher than usual that day, bright and clean after a night of rain. The air smelled of wet soil and crushed leaves, and from the porch, Kevin could see the thin line of smoke rising from the village stoves below. The world looked ordinary, again almost too ordinary, after everything that had changed between them. Dito stood beside him, fastening the strap of his worn satchel. "You're sure about this?" he asked, glancing sideways. Kevin smiled faintly, tugging at his sleeve. "We can't hide forever. People already know you're back." Dito exhaled through his nose, half a sigh, half a resigned laugh. "Then let's give them something true to talk about." They began their walk down the slope, the path still soft underfoot. The wind played with the edge of Kevin's shirt, carrying the scent of the river with it. Dito's hand brushed his once, twice, then found it fully, fingers interlacing in a motion that felt both defiant and natural. At first, Kevin wanted to pull away, old instinct, fear of eyes and whispers, but Dito's grip was steady, grounding, so he held on. The village was alive with color, women hanging clothes to dry, a farmer guiding an ox past the square, children chasing each other with sticks. When they passed, the noise dimmed just slightly like a curtain drawn halfway. Heads turned, some smiled in quiet recognition, others looked away too quickly. Kevin kept his eyes forward. Dito did not flinch. They stopped by the fruit stall first. The same old woman from the market, the one who once whispered of war and departures, watched them approach. Her wrinkled hands paused mid-count over a pile of mangoes. Kevin offered a polite nod. "Good morning, ma'am." Her eyes softened. "Morning, Doctor." "And you?" Her gaze lingered on Dito, her tone gentler than he expected. "You've come home from the fire." Dito inclined his head. "I have." She hesitated, then pressed an extra mango into his hand. "Then take this one for luck." For staying. Something in Kevin's chest eased. The small kindness felt like a benediction. They moved through the market slowly, speaking to no one yet greeted by many. Some faces held curiosity, others cautious respect. A few men from the patrol nodded to Dito, their gazes heavy with the unspoken language of soldiers who had survived what others hadn't. When they stopped by the tea stall, Dito leaned close. "They're watching you," he murmured. Kevin smiled without turning. "Then let them see how peace looks." They drank their tea sitting side by side on the low bench by the river's edge, the sound of water smoothing out the distance between words. For a while, they didn't speak. Dito's fingers toyed with the rim of his cup, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know if I remember how to live like this," he said quietly. Kevin looked at him, sunlight catching in his eyes. "Then we'll learn together." The afternoon passed in gentle fragments, small errands, passing laughter, quiet looks that spoke of something bigger than words. The weight that once lived in Kevin's chest began to shift. When they returned home, the hills shimmered gold. Dito carried a bundle of herbs on his shoulder. Kevin trailed a step behind, watching the steady line of his back, feeling a quiet pride bloom where fear used to live. At the porch, Dito turned to him. "It felt almost normal," he said, as though surprised by it. Kevin stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "That's the point. Normal isn't small, it's everything." Dito looked down at their joined hands, then back at him. The fading sun painted them both in amber light. "Then maybe this," he said softly, is our peace treaty." Kevin smiled, the kind that reached his eyes, signed and sealed, and as the wind carried the smell of tea and earth across the hill, the world seemed to exhale with them, slow, steady, whole. For the first time since the war began, Kevin and Dito didn't feel like survivors trying to remember how to live. They simply lived. A day like any other. The evening song. The day ended the way good days always should, quietly, without ceremony, with the kind of peace that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Kevin sat on the porch steps, the last of the sunlight brushing against his hair. He held a small wooden flute, worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to his father once, then to him. For years it had gathered dust, because playing it alone had felt like trying to sing through a wound. Now, with Dito nearby, the music returned. The melody began softly, more breath than sound, a thin, wavering note that trembled and then steadied. The tune was simple, an old lullaby from the village, one mothers hummed to their children when the rain was heavy. Kevin's fingers moved slowly, unhurried. Dito, seated just behind him, listened in silence. He leaned against one of the porch beams, his eyes closed, his hand absently rubbing the scar that crossed his forearm. The sound of the flute wrapped around him like the river's current, cool, familiar, forgiving. When the last note faded, Kevin turned his head slightly. "It's not perfect," he said, half embarrassed. Dito opened his eyes. "It doesn't need to be. It sounds like home." Kevin smiled, the kind that lit his eyes before his lips. "Then it's yours too." For a while, they stayed there talking about nothing and everything, letting laughter come where silence had been for too long. Dito told stories from the road, strange villages, kind strangers, nights under stars that looked too far away to belong to Earth. Kevin listened, his hand resting lightly on Dito's knee, grounding him in the present. As dusk deepened, fireflies began to stir among the tall grass. Kevin leaned back against Dito's shoulder, the warmth of him steady and real. "It's strange," he murmured, "after so much waiting, I don't know how to live without it." Dito's arm slipped around his waist. "Then wait for small things instead. The next sunrise, the next laugh, the next song." Kevin looked up at him, eyes soft in the dim light. "And if I lose them again?" Dito brushed a thumb along his jaw. "Then I'll find you first." Somewhere in the village, a distant voice began to sing a low, rhythmic tune, rising and falling like waves. Kevin joined in quietly, humming the harmony under his breath. Dito's heartbeat pulsed beneath his palm, syncing with the rhythm. When the song ended, the silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was alive, breathing, waiting. Kevin whispered, "I don't want this night to end." Dito smiled. "Then let's not let it." He tilted his head, pressing a soft kiss to Kevin's temple, then to his hairline. Kevin's eyes fluttered shut. The air smelled of jasmine and river wind, of life returning to its place. They stayed on the porch until the lanterns burned low, watching fireflies drift like floating embers across the field. The war, the years of silence, the ache, they all felt far away now, softened by the quiet pulse of music and the warmth of shared breath. And as night finally folded itself around them, the last thing Kevin heard before sleep was Dito's voice, low, steady, and full of a peace that had taken a lifetime to find. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we begin again. Tomorrow begins here." Morning unfolded gently, like the slow turning of a page. The mist lifted from the hills, revealing a sky so clear it almost hurt to look at. Birds darted between the trees, their songs weaving through the quiet hum of waking life. Kevin stood by the window, the light catching the edge of his hair. He held a mug of tea, both hands wrapped around it, steam rising in soft curls. Behind him, Dito stood half asleep, arm draped lazily across the sheets where Kevin had been moments before. For a while, Kevin simply watched the world outside. The village roofs gleamed with dew. A farmer's cart creaked along the road below. Everything looked the same and yet nothing did. "You're awake too early," Dito murmured, voice thick with sleep. Kevin turned, smiling. "Someone has to make sure the sun comes up." Dito propped himself on one elbow, squinting toward the window. "Looks like it managed fine without you." Kevin chuckled, setting the cup aside. "Maybe, but it's nicer when I have someone to share it with." Dito reached out a hand, wordless invitation. Kevin crossed the short distance and let himself be pulled back into the warmth of the bed. Dito wrapped his arms around him, their bodies fitting in that easy, practiced way of two people who had forgotten the shape of distance. "I could get used to this," Dito murmured against his temple. Kevin's voice was soft. Then they lay there for a long while, listening to the slow heartbeat of the morning. It wasn't passion now, it was peace. The quiet after storms, the kind of silence that spoke of lives beginning again. When they finally rose, it was with laughter, the kind that came from shared clumsiness, from bumping elbows while dressing, from the warmth of mundane things. Ditto burned the first pan of rice. Kevin teased him mercilessly until Ditto retaliated by flicking water at him from the kettle. It was all so ordinary, and that was what made it sacred. Later, they stepped outside together. The path still glistened with dew, and the river shimmered below, the same river that had washed the war from Ditto's skin. A soft wind moved through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the hills. Ditto paused, his gaze tracing the horizon. "It feels different," he said quietly. Kevin followed his eyes. "Because you're seeing it now, not surviving it." Ditto nodded, taking a slow breath. "I think I forgot how to hope." Kevin reached for his hand, fingers threading through his. "Then start small. Hope for tea that doesn't go cold. Hope for days like this." Ditto turned to him, a small, genuine smile tugging at his mouth. "And you?" Kevin looked back toward the house, the hills, the sky that stretched endlessly above them. "I'll hope for tomorrow," he said simply. "As long as you're in it." For a long time, they stood that way side by side, the morning light climbing higher, their hands joined between them. The war might still rage beyond the valley, the world might still demand its weight in grief, but here, now, they had carved a small corner of peace. And as the wind brushed through the fields, and the light spilled warm across their faces, it felt like a beginning, not a return to what was lost, but the quiet birth of something new. Tomorrow began here.